I am Benyamin Cohen. I'm a senior writer at The Forward, America's oldest Jewish newspaper. I'm going to talk a little later about a story I wrote recently about um, why 1,200 Nazis spent some of the Holocaust in America at a luxury resort in West Virginia, and also in two other resorts in Virginia and North Carolina, which is a pretty interesting story. But since we all came here today to learn more about the Kindertransport, I want to pass the baton over to Jason, who, as Judy said at the beginning, is the grandson of a Kindertransport survivor and is very much involved in sharing the legacy and the story of the Kindertransport. So, Jason, you want to take it from here?
Certainly. Thanks, Benjamin. Hello, everybody. I'm excited to be here. I'm sad, of course, that Joseph wasn't able to be here because the impact and the stories that just reading about him, and I have not heard Joseph speak before, but I have been with other Kinder Transport survivors, is just tremendous. And so obviously I can't do that any justice, but I feel like I can tell a good story about my grandma, who was a Kinder Transport survivor. I guess about me briefly, I actually live in Kansas City with my wife and two daughters. I'm originally from Detroit. My job is I'm the executive director for Sertoma International, which is a national nonprofit based in Kansas City. And I've been doing this for about a year or two now. So this story, the story of my grandma, when I visit with schools particularly, I really like to, my angle is somewhat of a story of an immigrant, because our family immigrated to the United States in 1956. But, it's a story of survival, and a story of endurance. And my grandma pretty much did a little bit of all of that. Um, Up in the top left there, that's my grandma and my grandpa and myself, at a whopping 10 years old. I haven't had hair since I think I only had hair for 10 years after that. And That was somewhere in England. I'm not sure exactly where. I don't have it written on the back. My grandfather passed in 2010 and my grandma in 2020. But that was kind of the beginning of the story and when I started learning. And what I realized was when I was young, my grandma was kind of laying the foundation, telling us the story and bits and pieces. Sometimes it was just about her experience. But as a 10-year-old, you can only take so much of that in. And then other times it was through an experience like this. And she took I went in 1985 on a tour, both in England to visit family and then to Germany and Austria. And I really don't remember a lot about it. I have pictures, and the pictures jog memories and stuff as a 10-year-old boy. But I do remember my grandma crying, everywhere we went in Germany and Austria, and all the stories and the pain and the remembrance and all of that. And it definitely stuck with me, but I didn't realize it for years after that. And she did other things when we were young. She talked about going on the March of the Living and invited us at times. Um, she uh her and my grandfather offered to take us to Israel when we were both my sister and I when we were in our late teens or early 20s. And for various reasons couldn't afford to go at that point, and I was too proud to tell my grandma and grandpa that I couldn't afford to take off the time of work or anything like that. So I never got those opportunities. So I make sure now that I don't pass those opportunities up. But people often, when I speak to groups, a lot of times the grandparents, particularly, one of the things I hear is, "Well, how do I get my grandson or my granddaughter to pay attention, to care about the story?" And what I often say is, just plant the seeds. I was a disinterested grandchild as well. I didn't understand the impact it had on her and the family and that. Even to the point when I was about 21 or 22, she wrote me a scathing letter, about how I was like the best, worst grandchild in the history of the world, I think. And I still have I still have the letter. I keep it as a remembrance. I never told Grandma I kept it. She probably forgot about it too, but it is definitely something that I look back upon. And the picture to the right there is just my grandma and I, probably around the time she was 92 or so. Later in her life, and just enjoying one of those moments. And she enjoyed this. She every once in a while she'd be okay with a selfie or me taking a picture of her when I make her get into a Jeep or something out of the ordinary at her older age. Oh, I'm having a. Oh, there we go. So Grandma came from Vienna. She lived in the Leopoldstadt neighborhood or area of Vienna. And as you can see on the map, you can kind of just, everybody's probably familiar, but you can get a perspective as to where traveled from. So she eventually made her journey, went from Vienna all the way up to a little bit northeast of where that point is for Great Britain, is where she eventually ended up. Um, like a lot of families now, extended family was a very important aspect, and she was actually raised primarily by her grandparents. Her father died when I think she was probably 9, but her parents had been divorced for a few years. So she saw her father. She remembered seeing her father occasionally up until about 1933 or 1934, and going to see his house and that, but she didn't remember a lot beyond that of the time with her father. But we never really understood why, and we have different ideas as to why she lived with her grandparents. And there's obviously family rumors, but her mom was around occasionally, but not once the war began. And so she primarily thought of her grandparents as the caregivers. Her upbringing was, every bit like probably any other kid at the time. She was the picture to the right there that says Heinrich Coleman. That was her grandfather. They had a grocery store in the Leopoldstadt neighborhood, and they lived above it in an apartment above it. And the picture to the left, can't quite see it, but towards the oval shaped doorway is there. There's actually a plaque on the wall dedicated to the family, and they lived upstairs there. And she often talked about, how they went to school down the street, 3 or 4 blocks away, at the quote unquote real gymnasium, which, to my understanding, the gymnasium was the school, the official school back then. She remembered that, the school for them was all day, and it was mixed. It was a public school that taught religion, which I think is a very interesting concept. And basically, they had religion every day. And every day, the kids split up. They all went to school together, and then they split up for a couple hours every day. The Jewish kids went and learned from a rabbi. The Catholic kids went and learned from a priest. The Protestant kids went and learned from a pastor. And then they all came back together. And so I think she didn't really think anything of it. It was just part of it. And she, like any kid at that time, could, be out in the neighborhood. She remembered a park that was nearby that has the big Ferris wheel and so forth. And, until 1938 or 1939, 1938, she wasn't really aware of anything that was going on around the world. But then Kristallnacht happened, and the Night of Broken Glass in November of 1938, and that kind of changed things. Um, that night, she remembered coming home. She basically got home from, I don't know if she was at school or from where she was coming home from, but she was 12 years old at the time, and she came home and she remembered seeing the glass broken and the storefronts damaged, including her own and her grandfather's. And her grandparents had gone upstairs, maybe surveying the scene or whatever, and but her uncle was still down on the street. And as she got closer, she remembered her uncle going to help an elderly gentleman who was scrubbing the streets. They were making the Jews scrub the streets with toothbrushes and anything else, and German soldiers laughing and having fun with it all. And her uncle went to help an elderly gentleman, and he was promptly beaten. and taken away to Dachau. And they were lucky. He was lucky at that point because about a month or two later, um, due to some influential family friends, they were able to buy his release. And so he was able to actually come back. But from that point on, she indicated that things had changed and life had started to change, and things that she could do before she couldn't necessarily do before or do anymore. And that was kind of that turning point for probably a lot of kids. But meanwhile, around the world or in Europe, around Europe, there were refugee committees hard at work already, and they were working to get kids, families, adults, older people, even men, out of what was now becoming a situation, a more dire situation across uh, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. And that work kind of went on behind the scenes. There is obviously a lot of reference to different refugee committees, and the more and more research that comes out, the more and more we see that there was groups doing that in France and England and Sweden and other places. And in England, the Kindertransport concept was born, and that first Kindertransport took place, I believe, December 1st, 1938, and that was a big deal. And so, to be able to get on the Kindertransport, you had to raise in England. They were raising £50, which was a pretty significant sum. In some cases, it was paid for privately. In many cases, it was paid for by a committee or by a group. And in my grandmother's case, it was paid for by a group. This is what the scene looked like at a train station. This obviously, many of you have probably seen this photo before, one of the more famous photos. We don't have any photos in our family from the train station or anything like that. But we do have stories that grandma used to tell, and this is what it looked like. What's interesting here is this, obviously it looks like there's a little bit of daylight. A lot of the research has come to show that a lot of the Kindertransport trains left in the middle of the night, especially early on, because the Nazis didn't want people to know that they were allowing this to happen. My grandmother was taken to the train in May 13th, 1939, and she didn't know where she was going. She had a bag. Her grandparents had a bag. She went with her grandparents and her uncle, and had no clue. Didn't recall being told where I was going, what I was going to do when I got there. Just knowing that she was being sent somewhere to be safe. And many of those kids, faced that same fate. And she got to the train station, and she was put on the train by her uncle and her grandfather. And she indicated she looked around and didn't see her grandmother until it's a certain point on the train. She saw her grandmother off in the distance. Presumably, her grandmother couldn't stand to see her being put on a train, probably at that point knowing that it was going to get worse, maybe not knowing the fate that they would end up having. But she was sent away on a train, on a Kindertransport in 1939, May of 1939. At the time, she was uh, 12 years old. She would have turned 13, or I'm sorry, she would have been 13 years old and turned 14 that year. Um, and she didn't remember a lot. And I imagine it's a pretty traumatic experience, where some kids will, some Kindertransport survivors will tell you they remember that train ride. But many that I've heard speak have said they don't really remember much. She did remember when they got to Holland, and they passed, and she stopped, and they passed tea and cookies. And the kids, I would assume, because they haven't had much to eat, were probably pretty overjoyed. But it was a quick stop, and that quick stop was just to, fuel up and move on. And so the train from there went on to the Hook of Holland, where they boarded ferries and headed to England. And the Kindertransport, that I speak of, obviously, Most of these kids were going to England. However, there were other countries that took kids in. Sweden, I believe, won. France probably took some kids in. Maybe Holland, but about 10,000 children went to England during that time frame, and this kind of symbolizes that beginning experience. So the quilt piece in the middle there is a quilt piece that was designed by my grandma in, I believe, 1987 or 1988, and this is part of the Kindertransport quilt exhibit, which has been displayed um, in many different places. It resides at the Zeckelman Holocaust Center in Detroit, the originals. And then the Kindertransport Association has a panel display that visits Jewish museums, Holocaust centers, and other museums around the world. And this just is what Grandma remembered. And many of the others you can see there are the different memories from other Kindertransport survivors at that time. So upon arriving in England, they they were she was lucky in a sense because her mom was there, and that was not the case for everybody else. So her mom had actually been in England on in the family. We say she was there on business, though nobody really knows what that business was or how long she had been there. Her grandma, my grandma, had not didn't know that, but she was a housekeeper or had been a cook for a little while, and assuming, we assume she had raised the money to bring her there. And so her mom met her there. However, her mom was not able to keep her. So she was able to spend a couple days with her mom, and then she was sent on to a hostel. The picture to the right there is a statue memorial there in London, outside of one of the train stations where many of the kids representing what it was like, and the plaque there at the Liverpool Street station as well. And she, from there, she went to a hostel in Northern England. It's about a 5 hour train ride up to Tynemouth, and that was her new home. And my grandma in that picture is the second from the right, short. She was all of 4'11", I think, or maybe 5 feet tall on a good day. But these were two of the house mothers and two of the one older girl and that were there at the hostel. And so the interesting thing was she got sent to this hostel, and one of the ladies there, Alice Erbach, had been a famous Viennese chef, and she was sought. There's a great story about her, and her daughter or her granddaughter shares a great story about her background. And she had been recruited to go and be the house mother there, and she had hired Miss, I believe it's Vivian Sieber, to be like an assistant house mother or house matron. And the interesting connection was Alice Erbach had been when she was a chef, and she often said she was, the Julia Child before Julia Child, and this would be in Vienna and Austria in the 20s and 30s. But she had taught cooking classes to my great grandmother, so my grandma's grandma, or my grandma's mother, and we actually still have copies of the notes from those classes, which now reside at the Museum of Exile in Frankfurt, Germany, for the time being. And so she went to this hostel, and she lived in a hostel for a couple years. And because of her age, that was she was probably in a little different situation because kids were coming. She was 13 and kids were coming. There were toddlers and little ones. And she used to say there were the little ones, the medium ones, and the big ones. And she's, quoted that a few times. But life was not easy at the hostel. She weathered it pretty well, but what, comes to light, obviously many, many years later, is that a lot of the kids remember it not being a fun and pleasant time. The hostel was maybe unique, maybe not. They tried to keep kosher, or they did keep kosher. It was 20 or 22 girls um, of all ages. My grandma remembers, specific ones like the Czech girl who came and couldn't speak German and couldn't speak English. And so she really couldn't communicate for a while. And many of the kids were like that. They went to school, but she was not, she was only able to go to school for a little while because she aged out of school at that point, and then she spent more time working um, and so on. So she lived for almost 2 full years with 20 refugee children. And, 85% of these kids never saw their parents or their families again. That's kind of the rough estimate based on the research that's been done. So it was an interesting, probably, time for them. To kind of go back to the Alice Erbach piece, one of the things that's interesting and would make for a great presentation, and actually, Alice's granddaughter talks often about it, was the cookbook on the left there was Alice's cookbook, published in 1935, 1936 in Vienna. The cookbook on the right was um, presumably or supposedly published by Rudolf Rosch. However, Rudolf Rosch is not an actual person. The Nazis stole authorship of many, many thousands of books during that time. They would burn the other books and then steal authorship, change the cover, change the name, even to people who didn't exist, and and then start to market it. And so they're just in the last couple years. Karina, Alice's granddaughter, has published a lot of information about how the Nazis would steal that authorship. It so happens that in 1979, Alice presented my grandma with the copy of the cookbook on the left. It's fully in German, so as somebody who is a food aficionado, I can't do anything with it. But it is a very interesting piece to have and to be able to show from that time frame. So back to the hostel, hostel life was, you can see that, the kids had fun still. They didn't know what they didn't know at times, and I know times were tough. But in the top left, my grandmother is kind of laying down in the front there. That was a beach nearby that they would be able to go to, and some pictures with some of the other girls and different age, and you can see kind of the age range from 3 or 4 years old up to probably 15 or 16 years old, and that. And the hostel is in Tynemouth, which is in the northern part of England. And the plaque to the bottom left there talks about the hostel, which the interesting part is the owners who bought it maybe 10 years ago had no clue about the story of the hostel. It's an actual 8 bedroom. I think it's like an 8 bedroom, 4 bathroom house now. But this is what it was back then. And so they have been super gracious. This plaque resides there. People who have had daughters and granddaughters have gone there to visit, and they give tour. They don't advertise tours, but they've been able to go in and see it and hear the story and that. And my grandma remembered some of that time during the hostel. They did move at one point. They moved from Tynemouth to the Lake District, which is more in the western part of England, when the war had come closer to the forefront. The picture to the left is a picture of my grandmother when during that time frame, probably post hostel, and while she was working, and so she aged out of the hostel in 1943. 1943, and had to go to work. And so she worked a little bit while she was in the hostel, but then she was working full time. She was a librarian for Boots the Chemist, which is a pharmacy chain. I think it's interesting. I don't know if they have libraries anymore, but it's a pharmacy chain that had libraries. And so she was a librarian for a while. And then in 1944, she joined the Women's Royal Air Force Auxiliary, and to serve, and she became a flight mechanic. So an interesting choice of careers. from librarian to flight mechanic, and was in the Royal Air Force Auxiliary until the end of the war. And at the bottom right there, you can see she met my grandfather, he was actually a flight mechanic in the Royal Air Force, and they got married in 1945. They had to they eloped to Scotland because my grandmother was not 21 years old. And in England, you had to be 21 or have your parents' permission. And her mother wouldn't give permission because my grandfather at the time was not Jewish. So they eloped, and they made their life in England. They lived in England, and my aunt Susan and my father Robert were both born in England in the late 1940s, and they lived in England until 1956 when they immigrated to the United States. And that's the boat that many people came across on the Flandre. And they made their way to Detroit, where they settled for 25 years. Um, and grandma took a third career when she came here. She became a dental assistant, maybe working on airplanes means you can fit your hands into small little things in people's mouths and be a dental assistant. But she was a dental assistant for like 30 plus years before she retired and eventually moved to Florida. My grandmother passed in 2020, not from COVID. But I do say that, COVID's probably what killed her spirit, because that was the time she wasn't able. The things she enjoyed at that point in her life were volunteering at the temple and volunteering at the hospital. She couldn't really do it anymore. And so we're fortunate that we've had some great opportunities to hear some of these stories. And I will say, this was a quick, I have this together and I do this for kids. I have other documents and a lot of stuff that I haven't baked into my presentation because typically I'm given a 20-minute presentation to a school. And as I landed, I'm actually in Mexico City right now. I landed about 2 hours ago and came to my hotel to put this together. So, it's a good opportunity to tell her story. I like to finish with this. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And the one thing I will often say about my grandma is, the Holocaust survivors that I have been fortunate to meet, which are, there's a conference every year for survivors and their descendants that I attend. And so I'm fortunate, there might be 20 or 30 or 40 survivors each year. Um, there's a whole variety of experiences. There's a whole variety of mentality. My grandma was not one to lament what had happened. She always wanted to make sure we understood and we knew, and this would never happen again. But she talked about how Austria was her place of birth, and England was her place of refuge, and the United States was.
Early December 1941. And at that point, the US was kind of forced, to dive deep into World War II when they were attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor. And so here was the problem. The problem was we were all of a sudden overnight went into war with the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians. And the problem was we had all of these diplomats who were living in the United States at the time. German diplomats, Italian diplomats, Japanese diplomats. They worked at the embassy in Washington. I mean, they worked at the embassy in Washington. They worked at consulates around the country in San Francisco and other places. And so there were hundreds of these diplomats who were, um, we didn't want to put them in jail, but we didn't know what to do with them. The U.S. didn't know what to do with these diplomats and their families. The issue was they wanted to treat them well because there were all these American diplomats in Germany and Japan, and America wanted the American diplomats to be treated well. And so, in order to do that, they had to set up this kind of reciprocity. If we treat these German and Japanese diplomats well, hopefully our U.S. diplomats overseas abroad will also be treated well. So that is why America decided to send these Nazis and their families to 3 luxury resorts. This is a piece of paper where they were describing the first 2 resorts. It was a handwritten note from the State Department saying, "Let's choose these two hotels: Greenbrier Hotel, which is in West Virginia, and the Homestead Hotel, which is in neighboring Virginia." One of the reasons they chose the Greenbrier is as follows, a couple reasons. Number one, it was only about the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia is 200 miles about west of Washington, D.C. So a lot of the U.S. politicians in D.C. were very familiar with the Greenbrier. In fact, they vacationed here often at the Greenbrier. So when they were looking for a resort to put up all these German and Japanese diplomats, they were very familiar with the Greenbrier because they themselves had stayed there. As a matter of fact, some of these German diplomats themselves had vacationed at the Greenbrier before. So everyone was familiar with the Greenbrier. The other nice thing about the Greenbrier was it was on a not only was it on a train line, there was a train station, there was a train stop on the property of the resort itself. So it was you didn't have to like go to a train station and then transport these detainees. You literally could put them on a train and they would get off on the property of the Greenbrier. So it was a very convenient and efficient place to send people because people could just get off the train and they were at the hotel. So they decided. So Pearl Harbor happened 12 days later. 12 days later. That's how quick. We often think about how government is so very slow to come up with ideas and to implement things. But this was super fast. Can you imagine this? A government doing this today? So 12 days after Pearl Harbor, they had set up these two hotels, the Greenbrier and the Homestead, to send the diplomats to. That's how quick they took over these two hotels. It was a good thing. It was easy to do actually, it wasn't so hard to do because it was the winter time. It was December, and both of these hotels um, were very sparsely did not have a lot of guests in the winter time. Nowadays, they're both 365 days a year. They're all year resorts, but back then in those days, um, there was not that many guests there, so they just had to kick out some guests so that they could take over both hotels. Eventually, they would also take over another hotel in North Carolina, in Asheville, North Carolina, called the Grove Park Inn. So that's why they took over these hotels for reciprocity to treat these diplomats well, with the hope that American diplomats would be treated well. So they had to quickly retrofit these hotels. So this is one of the pictures. This is a picture of the Greenbrier at the time in December 1941. They had to quickly build some guard shacks. So you see on the bottom of this picture, there is a guard shack that they built. And they built these guard shacks all around the perimeter of the property. Now, again, this town, White Sulphur Springs, is literally in the middle of nowhere. So it's not like these people could run and really get to anywhere. But they built these guard shacks around the property. And they brought in border guards from the U.S.-Mexico border to run these guard shacks. And these border guards loved it because it was really like hot, on the U.S.-Mexico border. And here they were being put up. The guards got to live at the Greenbrier. Okay, so you had several hundred diplomats. You had their families arrive here. So that's their wife and their kids and even their pets. There were at least a dozen dogs here. There was some parrots. All these diplomats brought their pets with them because you imagine, and they brought all these suitcases of all their belongings, and they basically checked into the Greenbrier and lived there for 7 months, from December 1941 to about July 1942. Um, and so, but they were treated as normal guests. So there were no other guests there at the time. They kicked out whatever few guests were there. But when the diplomats came, and at its peak, the Greenbrier hosted about 1,200 diplomats. At its peak, the diplomats were treated, and their families were treated like a normal guest. So they dined in the ballroom on fine china. They had waiters serving them, in tuxedos. The women got dressed up in fur coats every night. I'll show you a picture. Here's a picture of Bibi and Hans Thompson. So Hans Thompson was Hitler's top diplomat in D.C. He was the first to arrive off the train at the Greenbrier, and this is what they dressed like at the Greenbrier. They, like I said, they weren't, they weren't prisoners. I mean, they couldn't leave the property, but inside the resort, they were treated like normal guests. They got dressed up for dinner. Um, they Here's a picture of them at the Greenbrier. You see the ladies are wearing fur coats. Um, they had all the amenities at the resort. So first of all, the resort hired a pianist, an organist, Nathan Portnoff, and he played in the lobby of the resort and just to entertain the diplomats, the Nazis and the Japanese. And as you see, the kids really liked Nathan Portnoff, and this is a picture of two Japanese children sitting with Nathan Portnoff. The interesting thing, the irony of Nathan Portnoff was Jewish. He was the son of a rabbi. So he was a Jewish person working at the Greenbrier, entertaining the Nazis and the other Axis diplomats, which was kind of crazy. I interviewed Nathan's granddaughter, and she was telling me some really fascinating stories about him. But like I said, the diplomats were treated to all the amenities that the resort had to offer. So, what did they do all day? So they here's some Nazi wives playing ping pong at the Greenbrier. Um, there was an indoor swimming pool that they had an Olympic swimmer who would give lessons to the detainees. Um, there was a frozen. It was winter time. One of the lakes had frozen over. So a lot of the Nazis and their families went ice skating on the frozen lake. Now again, you had hundreds of kids here, and so the kids needed. It was during the school year from December to July, and so they set up on the property of the Greenbrier. They have all these like cottages and other buildings, and so they set up schools for the German kids, and then they set up schools for the Japanese kids. Um, so there were, so the kids, could still get their education as well. And they'd lounged, the families lounged by the pool, they ate gourmet food, they shopped in the boutiques. Um, there were actually at least two Nazi wives who went into labor during the 7 months they were there at the Greenbrier. And so they were escorted, they were able to go off site to the hospital in White Sulphur Springs to deliver their children. Here is a picture. So at the beginning of the detainment, the Italians were also there at the Greenbrier. This is a picture of the Italian detainees. The Italians did not get along with the Germans at all. And so eventually the Italians were sent to the Grove Park Inn in North Carolina. Here is a picture of some Japanese detainees at the Greenbrier. You see, they do not look like, prisoners. They're living the life of luxury at this resort, but they couldn't leave the property. Here is what I was explaining. Some of the kids, these are German children outside their cottage. They had schools in these cottages. These cottages are still there if you go and visit this resort. Here's a picture of some Japanese school children and their teachers. Here's a picture of Japanese diplomats and their families in front of the Greenbrier in May 1942. It's a very almost looks like the White House, like those columns and stuff. So as I said, the Italians did not get along with the Germans. They would fight with them in the ballroom and stuff. And so eventually the Italians were packed up and went to the Grove Park Inn in Asheville, North Carolina. This is a picture of a bellhop helping the Italians pack up all their luggage. What happened was they came sometimes with a lot of luggage, and then they left with even more luggage because their wives would be shopping at the boutiques and all the clothing and all the stuff that they would be buying at the mall inside the resort. And they ended up leaving the guide when I went on the tour. She said these Nazi wives came with 2 suitcases and left with 10 suitcases because they just did so much shopping there. So this is a picture of a bellhop packing up the Italians. This is a picture of the Italians leaving the hotel. Um, uh, 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 an- uh, Another interesting thing about this stay at the Greenbrier was three departments of the U.S. government were monitoring in charge of this project: the FBI, the State Department, and the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. They oversaw the operations, and they had agents staying in the hotel. So we have, 1,200 Nazis and Japanese and their families. You have also hundreds of agents, government agents staying there, and guards guarding everything. The U.S. government, the U.S. taxpayers paid for this detainment. So the government paid the Greenbrier $10 a day. This is back in 1942 money, which is probably worth about $200 a day today. So $10 a day or 200 in modern currency per Nazi. It was $5 for the kids. So $10 per adult, $5 for the kids, and $8 for the FBI and State Department agents who were living at the hotel. So it was an expensive thing for the government to put on this operation. The other interesting thing about this operation was it was a great way to glean information from the Nazis. So it was like a spy. You could spy on these Nazis because they would be talking on the phone, and all the phones were monitored. Um, these Nazis, let's say after dinner, they would walk over to the bar and they'd be getting drunk at the bar. And sometimes maybe they would start to get a little verbose and maybe they'd let something slip when they were drunk. And the bartenders and the waiters and the bellhops and everyone who worked at the Greenbrier was taking notes and listening in and to see if they got any useful information. And they would give that information to the agents, the FBI agents and the State Department agents who worked at the hotel. I was told that there was a spa at the resort, and these Nazis would go and get massages. And I was told the masseuses used to get the best information because the Nazis were just so relaxed after a spa treatment that they would let like a secret slip. And so the masseuses often got useful information. Um, when um, the Nazis would still be getting paid. They got paid by Germany while they still got their salaries from Germany while they were living at the Greenbrier. And so a Swiss intermediary would come with envelopes of cash. He was like a Swiss diplomat would come as an intermediary and pay them all their salaries, you know, every week so that they had money to spend at the Greenbrier. That's how they paid for these, at the wives paid for the stuff at the shops at the Greenbrier. Um, after and then in July 1942, 7 months had gone by, and the U.S. government and the German and Japanese government had worked out a trade. Send us back our diplomats, we'll send you back our your diplomats. So after 7 months, they had ironed out the negotiations, and in the summer of 1942, all of these diplomats, the German, Italian, and Japanese diplomats, took a ship. They took three different ships and went back to their home countries. And the U.S. diplomats took ships and came back to America. So the whole ordeal, this whole chapter in history, was about 7 months. When they got back, this is a picture of Hans Thompson in the middle, in the black suit. He was welcomed back with a hero's welcome by Adolf Hitler after he returned. So, he was a very important person in the Nazi regime. So the interesting story, there's a couple interesting postscripts to this story. The Greenbrier was used 3 times in history. The U.S. government took over the Greenbrier Hotel to use the Greenbrier Hotel. And again, they did this because they were very familiar with the Greenbrier because it was so close to DC and all the politicians used to vacation there. So there were 3 episodes in history where the U.S. government took over the Greenbrier Hotel. The first we just talked about, and I'll quickly tell you about the other 2. Shortly after, less than a year after the Nazis left, there were all of these soldiers, U.S. soldiers, returning from war, and they were injured U.S. soldiers returning from war, and the U.S. needed to set up a military hospital to take care of all of these wounded soldiers. And so they took over the Greenbrier again, kicked all the guests out of the Greenbrier. This was in the fall of 1942. And they turned it into the Ashford General Hospital, and it was run by the U.S. military. And so again, these there was no guests at the Greenbrier, and it was just a place for returning veterans to come and get medical attention. So here's a picture of soldiers and nurses at the Greenbrier. Um, Here's another picture of soldiers at the Greenbrier. Again, this was in 1942, 1943. These were soldiers and their girlfriends at the Greenbrier. This is a great picture. This is a picture of a wounded soldier who lost his leg in war, and he was playing golf at the Greenbrier while he was recovering. This is a picture of General Eisenhower at the hospital, visiting the hospital. So that was the second time in history when the U.S. government took over the Greenbrier. The third time is perhaps the craziest, most bizarre story. So that story is as follows. In the early 1960s, the U.S. we were at war. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were worried that the Soviet Union would attack us with a nuclear weapon. And so if you remember, for people who were around back then, or your parents or grandparents, they would talk about, going to school in that 1950s and early 1960s, and they were taught about, duck and cover and going under your school desk in case of a nuclear attack. And so the government was worried, Congress was worried that if there's a nuclear attack on DC, where are we going to go? We need a shelter for Congress to survive an apocalyptic attack. So they called up the Greenbrier and they said, we're going to pay you to build an underground shelter at the Greenbrier that can hold about 1,000 people. It's the size of several football fields. And this will be an underground bunker for members of Congress, the House and Senate, and their staff, and some of their staff. And this is where they would survive if there was a nuclear attack in DC. Again, this was an ideal location because it was only 200 miles from west of DC. So if there was a nuclear attack on DC, the thinking was it wouldn't impact the Greenbrier, which was 200 miles away, but it was still close enough. And it was, as I said, on the train line, the members of Congress could hop on the train and get quickly to the Greenbrier. So they built this underground bunker at the Greenbrier. Now, the point was to keep this a secret. So you're wondering, well, Benjamin, how did they keep this a secret? You have this great picture. People obviously saw all the construction that was going on. So the Greenbrier was very smart. They added on an entire new wing of the Greenbrier at this time. And they told everybody that's what the construction was. We're building this whole new wing of the Greenbrier. The reason we're going underground a little bit, air conditioning was just coming into mainstream use, and so they said we're building air conditioning pipes, and we need to go underground a little bit, but this is for a new wing. And so what they did was they built this underground bunker for Congress, and they built an entire new wing of the hotel on top of it. So nobody knew that there was actually a secret bunker underground. This is a picture as they were building the bunker. You see it's like this 8-ton steel, wall entrance to get into the bunker. This is what the bunker looks like today. If you visit the Greenbrier, you can actually see that door. So in the bunker, they had several things. They wanted, they had room for at least 1,000 people, members of Congress and some of their top staff, to live there. So they had dorms down there. They had a cafeteria down there. And they didn't know how long Congress would be down there. And they wanted to ensure that the work of Congress, the work of government, could continue. So they built underground 2 large auditoriums to mimic the House and the Senate floors so that the Congress people could gather and continue to do the work of government. So this, that's an entrance to the thing, a picture from today. That's an entrance to the bunker. So they built 2 large auditoriums. This is one of the auditoriums they built to hold, members of the House and Senate so that they could continue to pass laws and continue to do the work of government. The interesting story is in 1992, I think, sometime in the 90s, I think it was 92, This was a secret from 1962 to 1992. This whole underground bunker was a secret, and they kept it ready with food, stocked with food and everything in case there was ever some apocalyptic disaster where Congress needed to quickly go and hide in a bunker for shelter. And then in 1992, an intrepid reporter from the Washington Post discovered the underground bunker and wrote an article about it in the Washington Post and exposed its existence. And so since then, people know about it. So now it has been decommissioned. It's no longer an underground shelter. And the Greenbrier now offers tours for about $45, $50. You can go on a tour. It's a 90-minute tour. I went on it of the underground bunker. And so so if you're staying, you can go to the Greenbrier and sleep at the Greenbrier, and then you can go on a tour of the underground bunker. Um, so that those are the three times in history: the Nazis, the military hospital, and the underground bunker where the Greenbrier kind of served its country. And they looked at it as like, if you remember, in wartime, especially like during World War II, Americans were very patriotic, and what can we do to help the war effort? So and the Greenbrier looked at itself and it's like, this is the way we can help the war effort is house these German Japanese diplomats here while the governments of each country figures out what to do with them. Think about it. We treated them so well. And think about it today. We're reading in the headlines. The last thing I wanted to mention was extravagant grace. We read in the headlines today about what's happening with, migrants from other countries, and, we're shipping them off and, cages in El Salvador and all these stories of how our enemy, quote unquote, putting that in quotes, how our enemies are treated. Think back to the 1942, winter and spring of 1942, when we housed these Nazis and we treated them royally in these luxury resorts. So it's an interesting dichotomy, I think. If you're interested in learning more about the story of the Greenbrier, I recommend this great book. It's called Such Splendid Prisons, and it's about the three hotels that housed the Germans, Japanese, and Italians. It's called Such Splendid Prisons. It came out in 2020, and it's like 400-page book about what I just described to you. And also, I recommend, if you're interested in historical fiction, that book that got me interested in this story, which is In the Shadow of the Greenbrier. Question. So the first question I see here is for Jason. Jason, was your grandmother classified as an enemy alien?
No, she was only 14 in 1940. Primarily, I think 1940 was when the enemy alien push was. So she was only 14 at the time. I think that was mostly older kids at that point. Plus, she was further north at a hostel in northern England already. But we have not. I know she wasn't. We've never heard her talk about it. That would be my limited knowledge of the enemy alien act that was going on at that time. And I think it was mostly, more often than not, was boys, but there were probably girls as well, just at an older.
There was another question here. Somebody, I guess this is for me. Was the fight between the Germans and Italians physical? Yes, it was. I think a lot of the Italians were upset that their country was siding with Germany, with the Nazis. And so there was a lot of Italians who lived in the U.S. who just hated Germany. And they didn't want to be involved in this fight. And so they did have physical altercations with the Germans at the hotel, and they didn't want to sit in the same. There was also like, high school cafeteria kind of squabbles. They didn't want to sit in the same cafeteria, in the same ballroom as the Nazis. So it was just untenable. And, the U.S. government wanted to keep the detainees happy. And so they found the third hotel for the Italians. Someone else asked the question here. Keep typing questions in the chat if those have questions. Someone else asked the question: was the Greenbrier worried about the Nazis spying on the U.S.? Well, they really couldn't spy. They were stuck inside the hotel. I mean, in the grounds of the hotel. So there was not really much spying they could do. The government limited what information they got from the outside world. They were very upset. They wanted to have magazines and newspapers so that they could read the government, for whatever reason, only allowed the New York Times in to the resort. And so they were reading, that was really the only information they were getting from the outside world. Like I said, all the phone lines were tapped. So if these diplomats were calling outside, back home to Germany, everybody was listening. I think they knew that the phones were tapped also. So they weren't
I
really
have a
worried about the
question.
Nazis. Let me just finish one. They weren't really worried about the Nazis spying on the U.S. There were a handful of German waiters who worked at the hotel, and they had to fire those German waiters because the German waiters were handing things and sneaking things into the German diplomats. Jason, you had a question?
Yeah, well, I had somebody send it to me, but asked, I think generally, the question was talk about why there was no Kindertransport to the U.S. To my knowledge, there were about 1,000 kids over a 10 or 12-year period that did come to the U.S. Um, Kindertransport is German for children's transport, so it's commonly referred to the kids that went to England from 19 November of 38 to August of 39. The last train was scheduled on September 1st and didn't make it. And then, but there were, then you have Nicholas Winton's kids, the 660 some that went from Czechoslovakia. There were also other efforts in the U.S. I mean, this ties to a little bit of immigration policy and all of that. In the U.S. during that time, there were congressmen, senators. There was a bill, I believe, in 1939 that was introduced to allow 20,000 kids to come to the U.S. directly. However, much like today, immigration was a hot button issue, and there were also congressmen and senators who wanted to get rid of all immigration. And so there was definitely a debate there, and some of those bills didn't eventually pass. And I believe in 1939, 1940, there was actually a public opinion poll that was done about bringing. I don't know if it was bringing German kids or kids from Germany and Austria, similar to the Kindertransport, and like 2/3 of the people who responded said they did not want to open it up to bringing them here to the United States. And I think at that point, it was commonly known that many of these kids, most of these kids were going to be Jewish. And so it really does have, I mean, I can't speak to what people thought back then, but, it would seem very anti-Semitic at that time as well.
Let's see. I got a question here. What type of communications were available in the underground bunker? Well, this was built, think about there, we're having these conversations today about a new Air Force One. And so, Air Force One has to have all the communications for the president to talk to people. And, so the underground bunker, which was built for Congress in the early 1960s, again, it needed to be so that they could continue the work of government. So it had telephone lines, it had all the communication they needed that was available at the time. Obviously, like, the internet and fax machines, none of that was around in the early 1960s. But it was built for all the communication that was around at that time. Interestingly enough, as I said to you, um, it's now used, they give tours of the underground bunker. There is a section of the bunker which is not open to tours, and it's being rented out by a computer server company. They have all these server farms down there because it's just like, I guess it's cool down there. I'm not 100% sure why they use that space. Um, but they rent out some of the underground bunker now to a computer server farm. So it obviously has all the internet it needs right now. Someone asked a question for Jason. Jason, can you please talk about why there was no Oh, you said that to the U.S.
Yeah.
Then someone else asked me, do we happen to know if the Nazis treated the Americans similarly well? I think there's a mix of stories there. From what I could tell from reading that book, Such Splendid Prisons, some diplomats were treated well. I don't know if they were. I think so, like, there were a lot of them were put up at hotels, not necessarily 11,000 acre luxury resorts in the mountains with an indoor swimming pool. But they stayed at basic hotels. Some diplomats were not treated well. There were some in Japan who came back, emaciated, had been, deprived of food and things like that. So it's not, I think it helped to some extent that we treated their diplomats well, but not like 100%. I don't, any other questions?
Somebody did ask,
Uh,
Matt asked me, and I probably just skipped right over it. Both, my grandmother never saw her grandparents or her uncle again. Um, best we could find from the tracing service, the Red Cross and the tracing service, she could find years later, were that they were most likely transported on the death transport bow, and either died at Therenstat or Treblinka. We don't have final confirmation, but one of those couple locations.
any other questions?
I don't have anything else on my end.
Thank you all very much. You gave a wonderful, interesting presentation, both of you, and we hopefully can maybe do something like this again. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.